Date, January 18, 2043. Location, the Imperial Court of Siberia. Court case, Eddie Lazek's murder trial. The judge, a woman in her later 60s, sat waiting for Eddie to be brought into the courtroom. As Eddie arrived, he was placed at his podium sitting in his wheelchair. The judge began the trial by asking Eddie Mr. Lazek, in accordance with the crimes that you committed, do you have anything to say in your defense? What was your reason for killing? Eddie replied, he was a monster, he deserved to die. The judge then asked, is it true that he abused you and your half-sister? Eddie answered with yes. He was cruel to us both since birth. The older woman proceeded, did you also kill Elisa Petrov? The woman found in your half-sister's room. He shook his head, no, she was one of my father's victims, he said in regret. One of his victims? Do you know the exact number of people your father killed? Eddie shook his head once more. No, I only know of the two. He replied with a tear running down his cheek. Natalia Sharkovsky, Marta's mother. We buried her. The judge sighed. I understand this is difficult for you. From what your half-sister told me, she was like a mother to you. The man in the wheelchair just stayed silent and nodded. Then the judge asked, would you like to tell us what happened from the beginning? Eddie looked at the judge and began to remember. Prologue. Our story begins in Siberia, on November 2006, at the Rosewood farm owned by Mr. and Mrs. Lazek. The property has since been abandoned due to the terrible things that happened there. Mr. Ivan J. Lazek had quite a large plot of land and also owned up to 100 different animals. The Lazeks didn't have farm hands for two reasons. The first was that they lived in a rather isolated area, 100 miles away from the nearest town. The second reason was that Mrs. Lazek didn't really trust outsiders, as she was paranoid about people mistreating her animals and stealing from them. So Mr. Lazek tended to the land, the upkeep of the structures, the animal pens, and he also made sure no predators killed any of their livestock. He would do this by taking their Caucasian shepherd dog named Titan for a walk around the border of his land. Mrs. Lazek kept the house and animal pens clean as well as tended to the animals. She was a kind woman who never wanted to see any human or animal suffer. For as long as Ivan could remember, he always wanted a son, who would help him out working on the farm and be his best friend. Ivan loved his wife Eska, but because they lived so far away from the village, neither of them had any friends. Sadly, the couple didn't have enough money to drive to the village often, due to stock selling slowly, meaning they could only really ever go to fetch supplies. This made Ivan feel lonely and miserable. Eska and Ivan had been together for 15 years and all she wanted was for him to be happy, so that night they talked about trying for a baby. Eska never wanted kids, but to make her beloved husband happy she was willing to do this for him. It's not that Eska didn't like kids, it's just that she never really saw herself as a mother. Chapter 1: Stress and Secrets. For 1 month the married couple tried for a baby, but unfortunately, Eska couldn't get pregnant. She thought that maybe it was because of her age, as she was already 40 years old. That's why Ivan suggested that they should go see a doctor. Eska agreed, and that evening they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. After another 2 hours of sitting in the waiting room, they were eventually seen to. The couple talked to the doctor for a short while, and then he told them that because of her age it would be harder for her to have a baby, as her menstrual cycle will have slowed down. The doctor also suggested that there is the possibility that she may have a low egg count or that Ivan may have a low sperm count. The only way he could be sure about that would be by having some tests done on the two of them. Eska and Ivan agreed to the tests, and within an hour they were both told they could leave their contact information, and that they would be called in about 6 weeks to let them know the results. They drove back home, worried and anxious about what the news would be. When the call came 6 weeks later, The doctor told them that his suspicions were correct. Eska did have a low egg count. With the measurements they took of her hips, she was told that they were too small, which would make giving birth difficult. If there would happen to be any complications, it could get dangerous for her and the baby. In the worst case, they could both die. As Eska finished talking and put the phone down, she began crying. What did they say? Ivan asked out of concern for his wife. She could barely reply, for her tears made it difficult for her to speak. When she finally managed to tell him through her sobbing, Ivan's expression turned angry. He stood there staring at his wife for a moment with a look of pure fury, then he turned and punched the wall. Fuck! He yelled in frustration. Fighting her tears, Eska tried to calm Ivan down, but to no avail. She tugged on his shirt to get his attention, only for him to pull away, yelling for her to not touch him. For the next few months, things for the Lazeks got more and more stressful as Ivan's temper grew worse and Eska refused to sleep in the same bed as him out of fear. When Ivan did occasionally seem calm enough to talk sensibly, he would ask her if she would come sleep with him again, as he hated not having her next to him when he slept. Eska knew that Ivan was always very sexual whenever they slept together. She used to enjoy his constant attention, but now the thought only scared her. She knew it would only lead to sex, as she was the submissive type, so she would usually start panicking and screaming at him. All you want is sex, you greedy pig. Do you even care about my life? Because if you get me pregnant, it will be you that has ended it. At other times she would just completely blank him and change the subject. All of this was only making him more mad and sick of her, so one night Ivan devised a plan. Ivan told his wife that he was going to the village to go for a drink. Eska was less than impressed with the idea of him drowning his sorrows in booze, when they had very little money as it was. Despite her objections, she let him go so that she could have some peace and time to herself. Ivan got in his car and drove away down the old road that led to the village. As Ivan drove into the village, he headed straight for his old favorite bar, the Frozen King Inn. This was where he first met Eska and he had so many good memories of this place. Ivan remembered that Eska didn't like this place much, because of all the younger women that were always here ready to sell their backside to anyone. She found it disgraceful. Ivan remembered that time when Eska started a fight with one of them because they were flirting with him. That was the last time they ever came here. As Ivan sat down at the bar, he ordered a pint of beer and sat staring at the bottles on display behind the bar. The display wall was all one big mirror, and as Ivan was scanning the bar's selection of booze, he noticed a young beautiful woman with long black hair and a red dress that only went up to her knees, sitting at the table behind him staring. He turned around to look at her, and when their eyes met he began to feel a bit nauseous. What if Eska finds out? He thought to himself, reassuring himself that his wife would never learn of his betrayal. He grabbed his beer and walked over to her. "Hello there, do you work here?" he said calmly. The woman looked at him with a pleased expression. "I do," she said interestedly. "Ah, good, what is your name then?" he said, starting to feel a little nervous again. "My name is Natalia," she spoke seductively, wearing a pretty smile. "How much do you charge for the night?" Ivan asked, lowering his tone. 2,000, she replied, staring into his eyes. She could see the guilt building up from the look he gave her. "Isn't that a bit much for one night?" he responded, a bit shocked, trying to reason with her. "Look," Natalia said sternly, "I know you're not single by the look in your eyes, and there is also a chance I could get arrested for this. So sorry friend, but you're paying extra." Ivan panicked a little when she raised her voice. All right, keep it down," he begged in a whispering voice. "If my wife finds out, I'll be as good as dead." Natalia chuckled. "Yeah, I thought so." She took a sip of her drink and then continued. What happened between you and your wife anyway? Ivan sighed. She's afraid to have sex with me because she was told by a doctor that having a baby could kill her and the baby. Natalia looked at him with compassion and said, yeah, I don't blame her, I would be the same way if I had that problem. I'm so sorry to hear that. I was never much of a family person myself. Ivan and Natalia talked and drank until it was 4 in the morning, then Ivan booked a room for them in which they then disappeared for the night. For the next 2 years Ivan continued to visit Natalia at the inn whenever he could, and when Eska asked him where he was going, he told her he was going fishing with some friends. He also told her they would be staying in one of his friends' boathouses for the night. Eska had no reason not to believe him, as he never really lied to her before. She was also happier when she had the night to herself. Oddly, she had grown used to being alone and it didn't bother her anymore. If anything, she felt more at ease. When she wasn't busy looking after the livestock, she was relaxing by watching TV with Titan, who was asleep by the fireplace. Eska often wanted to take Titan for a walk, but she knew he was far too strong for her to handle and he would drag her around like a sled tied to a husky. Chapter 2: Life Finds a Way. One afternoon when Ivan went to meet with Natalia, they met at the inn as they always did. He bought drinks for both of them and brought them to a clean table. Natalia and Ivan sat and talked for a while as they usually did, then out of the blue Ivan started a conversation about her moving in with him. Natalia thought it was a stupid idea. And what about your wife? Don't you think it will be a bit suspicious if I came back with you? What am I meant to say? Hi, I live here now, she said jokingly. Ivan looked at her and laughed. No, 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 he chuckled. All you have to do is tell her that I've hired you as our new maid. Natalia laughed loudly. What? With the little money you have? Yeah, right, she'll never believe me, plus didn't you say she doesn't trust outsiders? Ivan nodded. Well, yeah, but before he finished his sentence she interrupted him and said, then how in the hell do you plan on getting this to work? Ivan sighed. Natalia, please let me finish. She gave him a look as if to tell him to go on. I've told you before, me and my wife don't have many friends, so all you have to do is become her friend, and then she would have more of a reason to let you stay. Obviously, you will still be getting paid for your services. Natalia shook her head. This is quite possibly the stupidest shit I've ever heard. I'm pretty sure your wife is not a complete moron, Ivan. She is bound to know something is up. Ivan was starting to get a little irritated. Are you gonna try my plan or not? Ivan said defensively. Natalia looked at him and rolled her eyes. All right, fine, but I'm telling you that this plan of yours is gonna backfire, and when it does, do not expect me to defend you. Ivan smiled and simply replied, that's fine with me. The next day Ivan drove Natalia to his house to introduce her to his wife. Natalia was nervous and didn't talk much on the way there. As they pulled into the driveway, Natalia looked at the farm and the large rustic old house that stood before her. Parking up, Ivan turned to her and said, now remember, watch what you say. Me and Eska already have enough problems, okay? Natalia nodded and they both got out of the car. They walked up to the front door and went in. Ivan turned to her and said, you should stay here while I go find Eska. Natalia nodded again and waited by the door from where she could hear Ivan calling for his wife as he ascended the stairs. She looked around at the decor of the large home. She looked up the stairs and as she turned to face the kitchen there was Eska glaring at her. As their eyes met, Natalia jumped a little in surprise and Eska immediately asked, can I help you? Natalia responded quickly, oh, I'm a friend of your husband. Eska looked at her judgingly. Is that so? She said in a slightly suspicious way. Ivan heard the women talking from upstairs and came down. Eska, he said sweetly as he stood next to her. Eska stared at Natalia. Ivan. Would you like to tell me why there is a strange woman standing in my hallway? Ivan grabbed and held his wife's hand. Now Eska, please don't get mad. I hired us a maid. Eska looked at him with anger. And how are we supposed to pay her, Ivan? We don't have the money for a maid, thanks to you and your fishing trips. I barely have the money to feed the animals or myself. What the fuck are you thinking? Eska insisted for her to be taken back to the village, but Ivan refused, saying I can't. Eska replied, why not? Ivan looked down, knowing she was going to get really mad at him, and said, because I've already paid her for this month. Eska's eyes widened. This month? How much? Ivan stood in silence, trying not to make eye contact with his already furious wife. 10,000. He said quietly. Eska couldn't believe her husband's recklessness. 10,000 rubles. 10 fucking thousand. Are you taking the fucking piss, Ivan? I can't believe you. Do you think that we just have loads of money to just fucking throw away? Ivan didn't know what to do. He knew she would be mad, but he didn't think it would be this bad. Eska, please. Eska began to walk up the stairs. No, Ivan. Don't talk to me and get that out of my house. As Eska disappeared up the stairs, Natalia looked at Ivan and said, I told you it wasn't going to work. Ivan shook his head and sighed. Natalia quietly said, so now what? Ivan put his hand to his head and rubbed his forehead. I'll let her calm down for a bit and then talk to her later. He gestured for Natalia to come into the living room and sit down. Natalia followed and said, but your wife doesn't want me here. Ivan turned on the TV and said, don't worry about it, I'll sort something out. Natalia shook her head and looked at the TV. 2 hours later, Eska came back down the stairs. She poked her head round the archway of the living room and said, Ivan. A word, please. Ivan got out of his chair and followed his wife into the kitchen. Why is she still here? She said angrily. Ivan looked back at Eska and replied, look honey, I paid the girl to work for us. I'm not just going to waste 10,000 rubles just because you're annoyed with me. Eska stood there with her arms crossed. If you don't make her leave, I'll set the dog on her. Ivan laughed. Well, no wonder you don't have any friends. Maybe try being nice to people every once in a while and you might get somewhere. Eska sat down at the kitchen table and began to cry. Ivan walked back into the living room with a smile on his face. Natalia looked at him with a look of disgust. She didn't deserve that, she said with an irritated glare. Ivan couldn't suppress a small laugh and said, and what do you know, huh? Nothing, that's what you know. Natalia shook her head and got up, walked into the kitchen, and sat down next to Eska. Natalia looked at her, took a tissue from out of her purse, and placed it in front of the weeping woman. He was wrong saying that to you. Eska took the tissue and wiped her tears, then said, you don't know me. Why would you even defend me? Natalia put her hand on the older woman's back and said, I understand why you are upset, but I'm here to help you and I was hoping we could get to know each other. Eska turned to Natalia and hugged her. I'm sorry, she said nicely as Natalia hugged her back. It's okay, don't worry about it. When Natalia finally got Eska to stop crying, they talked for a bit. Then Natalia took Eska upstairs to her room. She came back to find Ivan waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. Excellent performance, he said as he stared at her. Natalia was not amused. Oh, shut up, she said as she walked past him. Over the next couple of weeks, Eska warmed up to Natalia and they did become friends. With Natalia there, Eska seemed more cheerful and happier. Natalia spent more time with Eska than she did with Ivan, which he didn't seem to mind for as long as she came to him when he desired her. Natalia and Eska became best friends. Ivan used this to his advantage by getting Natalia to talk to Eska about kids. He was trying to ease her out of her fear using Natalia, and over time this started to work. Ivan was mildly shocked but very pleased to see his wife lying in their bed, waiting for him once again. They still weren't intimate for another month, but eventually, she refused to allow her fear to control her anymore and her desire took over. Despite all their arguing and disagreements, she had missed him a lot. She allowed him in once more. 4 months later, Eska noticed that she had gotten a small bump. She called for Natalia. "Oh my God, Eska, you're..." Natalia didn't even get to finish before they both looked at each other in excitement and hugged. "I'm so happy for you. We have to tell Ivan." They both made their way down the stairs and went outside to find Ivan, who was busy chopping firewood. Both women quickly walked up to Ivan and told him the news. Ivan dropped the axe that he was using and gave his wife a big hug as Natalia joined in. Things were good in the Lazek house until Eska started to get sick. They had a doctor come over to their house who diagnosed her with a bad case of the flu. She was bedridden for days and could barely stand. She couldn't eat properly, so she was weakened. She was given medication to help. Just when she was starting to recover a month before the baby was due, she got up out of bed with Natalia's help as she needed the toilet. As they were making their way to the bathroom, she was suddenly in great pain and her water broke. When Natalia yelled for Ivan to come help, Ivan shot up the stairs to his wife and began walking her back to their room. Ivan panicked and told Natalia to get some towels and stay with Eska, whilst Ivan ran downstairs and called an ambulance. When he was done on the phone, he ran back up the stairs and back to his wife, who was in serious pain. Ivan held his wife and told her to try and take deep breaths. Meanwhile, Natalia did her best to try and help calm her down. Eska's contractions started, which made her scream in agony as she began grabbing Ivan. "Please get me through this, please don't let me die." Her fear was real now. When Ivan heard her say these words, it was like everything was in slow motion. He seemed dazed, like he wasn't really there. Natalia woke him out of his dazed state by yelling in his face, "I think the baby is stuck." Ivan positioned himself in front of Eska and tried to pull out the baby with his hands. This did not work, however, as Ivan couldn't get his hands past the baby's head, which was half sticking out. Natalia was scared as she could see that Eska was getting tired and her pushes were getting weaker. Eska started passing in and out of consciousness while Natalia tried to keep her awake. "Ivan, you have to do something now," she said in a panic. Ivan thought about it for a few seconds, then ran back downstairs and returned with an assortment of sharp tools. Natalia looked at him in pure shock. "What are you doing?" Ivan placed a small knife next to his wife's legs and said, "She needs a cesarean now." Natalia grabbed his hand and said, "You can't do that." "What if you kill her?" Ivan pulled his hand out from her grip and said, "It's her only chance." He had grabbed some morphine out of the animal supply room and gave it to his wife. Eska slowly began to close her eyes with tears running down her face. She grabbed Ivan's hand as he was preparing himself and whispered in a shaky voice, "Please." Ivan held her hand. "Don't worry, honey, I'm gonna get you through this," he said as tears began streaming down his face as well. Ivan began cutting and within 2 minutes he had the baby freed, which he then wrapped in a towel and gave to Natalia to hold while he stitched Eska back up. At this point, Eska had already lost too much blood and was beyond saving. As she gave her last breath, her shaking hand pulled Ivan closer. "I love you, I always have." Ivan and Natalia cried until the ambulance finally arrived. The ambulance crew took Eska's body back to the hospital with Ivan, Natalia, and their newborn son. The baby was put in a life support machine. Ivan and Natalia waited outside the room the baby was in. A nurse came out and said, "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Lazek, but I do have to tell you that your son will have to stay here for a few weeks. The premature birth seems to have caused a few problems." Ivan gave a look of concern. "Will he be all right?" The nurse put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Your son has to be artificially ventilated because he was having a hard time breathing, but other than that he should be all right." Ivan looked at the nurse. "When will I be able to hold my son?" The nurse took her hand off him and replied, "When he's strong enough to breathe on his own." They both thanked her and the nurse went on with her work. 3 days later Ivan, accompanied by Natalia, was allowed to see his son. The nurse gave the boy to his father and said, "Did you and your wife pick out a name for him?" Ivan looked down at his son and noticed that his head was deformed and his spine had a slight curvature to the left side. That caused one of his legs to stick out further than the other. "We wanted to name him Eddie," he said, not taking his eyes off the child. "What's wrong with his back, head, and leg?" The nurse sighed and said, "We ran some tests on him today before we allowed you to see him. I'm afraid your son has a deformed skull and curvature of the spine, also known as scoliosis. I'm sorry to say that Eddie will most likely be permanently disabled. If he is able to walk, he'll only be able to walk short distances." Natalia hugged Ivan as he held Eddie. "Poor little guy," she said. Ivan stayed silent. He was so angry that he almost didn't want to hold Eddie anymore. After 10 minutes of silence, he asked Natalia to hold on to Eddie whilst he went to talk to a doctor. He walked to the front desk and asked for the doctor who x-rayed his son. After an hour of waiting around, the doctor was ready to see him. Ivan asked him if there was anything he could do about his son's deformations. He then replied, "Yes, there is corrective surgery, but it is very expensive." After talking with the doctor for another 10 minutes, Ivan decided to stand outside for a bit and cool off. He stood outside for a while and then returned to his son's room. When he came in, he sat down in an irritated manner. "Are you okay?" Natalia asked. Ivan did not reply, he just sat there with a blank stare while tapping his foot. "Ivan, would you like to hold Eddie again?" Ivan quickly snapped out of his endless stare and looked at his son. "No, put him back in the crib, he'll be tired." Natalia looked concerned. "Okay then." She placed him gently back in the crib and stroked his face. The day Ivan was allowed to take Eddie home, he got some startling news. The medical examiner who looked over his wife's body had determined that it wasn't the loss of blood that caused her to die. It was the illness made worse by her overexerting herself trying to give birth to Eddie. If she hadn't been sick, she would have likely survived. Ivan looked at the examiner and said with anger in his voice, "You mean to tell me that my son being born early is what killed her?" The examiner nodded and said, "In a manner of speaking." Ivan told Natalia to carry Eddie all the way home. He didn't even want to touch him when he got in the house. For the next 16 years, he completely ignored his son and let Natalia look after him. Ivan's hatred for his son was making him mildly deranged. He acted normal around Natalia, but deep inside he was disturbed. Many times he wanted to drown his son for being the cause of his wife's death. The thing that Ivan hated the most about Eddie was his Asperger's syndrome. From his point of view, the boy had the tendency of asking annoying questions, too many to answer at once. He also had a very aggravating laugh and didn't have a clue what he was talking about half the time. Ivan truly despised him and never really wanted to be around him. Chapter 3 How could you? Natalia became irritable about having to look after Eddie right from the start. Even though she didn't want to, she looked after him because who else would if not her, certainly not Ivan, that's for sure. The other reason was that she was still being paid to work and please Ivan. She believed Ivan's ignorance towards his son was selfish and unfair. Natalia was now at a point at which she didn't care about the money or the sex anymore, she just didn't want to be a nanny for Eddie. She also hated the way Ivan treated his son, calling him cruel and disgusting names as well as beating the poor boy whenever he either got too loud, started crying, or started laughing. Whenever Eddie tried to stand up for himself, Ivan would beat him till he could barely move and lock him in his room with no food or water for a couple of days. It took Natalia 5 years for her to convince Ivan to buy Eddie 2 wheelchairs. Thanks to Natalia, Eddie became a kind and gentle soul. One evening a big fight broke out between Ivan and his son because Eddie was playing with Titan, who was making Eddie laugh. Ivan told Eddie to shut up because he could hear him over the TV in the living room all the way from the kitchen. Eddie chose to ignore his father's warning and continued laughing at the dog as they played. After 5 minutes of listening to Eddie's infuriating laugh, he got up and yelled, "Eddie, you fucking retard, I told you to shut up," as Ivan walked into the kitchen. Eddie was sitting in his wheelchair, quietly petting the dog who was looking in Ivan's direction. Ivan pointed at Eddie and shouted, "If you don't keep your fucking mouth shut, I'll give you a reason never to make a sound again." Eddie looked at his father with an antagonizing glare. "You really need to learn to be nice to me," Eddie said in defiance. Ivan looked at Eddie and said, "What did you say to me, boy?" Titan started to growl at Ivan as he stepped closer while Eddie just smirked at him. "You think you're fucking clever, boy?" Eddie simply replied, "No, I know I'm not." He looked down. Ivan smiled and said, "Yeah, I know you're not because you're nothing but a deformed little shit." Eddie giggled to himself and then replied, "Well, at least I'm not like you." Titan growled and barked aggressively as Ivan charged towards his son while he tried to get out the way by rolling his wheelchair out of the kitchen. Hoping Titan would block him, but Titan backed up into Eddie's wheelchair and got his long fur caught in the wheel. As Titan yelped in pain, he jumped only to then run away. Ivan got a hold of Eddie's arm, tugged him out of his chair, and dragged him up the stairs. Natalia caught up to Ivan at the top of the stairs and began yelling at Ivan to let Eddie go. Ivan, who was still standing at the top of the stairs, decided that it was a good idea to take Natalia by her word and flung Eddie past her, down the stairs. Natalia rushed to help the 16-year-old boy whose father treated him like a rag doll. Ivan laughed at Eddie's pain as he watched Natalia pick him up and take him to the kitchen to clean his bloodied head. As she placed a wet piece of cloth on Eddie's head in order to clean the wound, the furious father came down and stood at the entrance to the kitchen. He began to laugh and said, "Have you learned your lesson yet, boy?" Natalia turned around. "What the fuck is wrong with you? You could have killed him." Ivan just smiled, chuckled, and cheerfully said, "Good. Serves the boy right." Natalia put her hands over her face, then taking them away she said, "I can't do this anymore, you are an abusive, ignorant pile of shit and we aren't going to take this anymore." Natalia grabbed Ivan's car keys from off the hook next to where he was standing. Ivan quickly grabbed her hand. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, surprised. "I'm leaving you, Ivan, and I'm taking your son with me." Ivan smacked Natalia across the face and threw her on the floor. "You're not going anywhere," he said as he walked over to the long cabinet on the wall next to the door leading outside. He opened it up and grabbed his shotgun. Walking back over to them, he pointed the gun at Natalia. "You want to leave? Well, if you try you'll be leaving in pieces," he said, smiling at her as she wiped the blood away from her split lip. Suddenly Titan ran up to Ivan and bit his arm, causing him to fall down. He yelled at Titan to get off and kicked the dog in the face. Titan let go only to then bite his leg instead. Ivan punched and punched at the big dog's head and face, but Titan would not let go. Ivan looked around for his shotgun, which he had dropped, and it had slid under the table. As Titan let go once more to bite his shoulder, it gave Ivan just enough time to grab the gun, and as he wrestled with Titan he managed to aim the gun at the dog's head. Ivan shot Titan in the head, but it didn't kill him immediately. Ivan got up as the dog whimpered, lying on the ground, moving his leg in pain. Ivan shot him again, this time killing him. Meanwhile, Natalia and Eddie had managed to get Eddie's wheelchair stuck in the frame of the side door. Not wanting to deal with any more annoyances, Ivan knocked Natalia out with the butt of his gun. He picked her up and put her on the table out of Eddie's way. Then he grabbed Eddie's chair handles and pulled it free with one swift yank, also taking some of the frame with it. As Eddie was turned by Ivan to face Titan, Eddie burst into tears. "What have you done?" he screamed. Eddie was then wheeled into his room and locked in. Ivan came back to grab Natalia's unconscious body, take her up to his room and place her on his bed. Ivan rummaged through his drawers and found 2 old leather belts. He tied Natalia to his bed's headboard, then went to get some rope to tie down her legs. After securing her to his bed, he was waiting for her to wake up so the fun could begin. Ivan's plan was to use Natalia to get a better son, one that wasn't completely useless. After being tied to Ivan's bed for 2 weeks, his relentless efforts had given him what he wanted, a new baby. 9 months later, when the baby was born, he discovered that it was a girl. Not wanting a daughter, he was going to kill her, but Natalia begged and begged Ivan to keep her, managing to convince him that she may prove useful. Natalia was allowed to be freed but was still confined to Ivan's room. The only time she was allowed to walk around the house was when Ivan accompanied her. Natalia asked him to let Eddie meet their daughter, which she had named Marta. Ivan agreed to this, as he thought that once Marta had become old enough, she could look after Eddie, so they wouldn't have to. Eddie immediately became attached to his half-sister and also was very protective of her over the years. Whenever Marta did something wrong, Eddie always insisted on Ivan beating him instead. Sadly, Eddie wasn't always successful at shielding his sister from their father, but helping each other made them come closer. From the age of 10 all the way up to 18, Marta was Eddie's carer. She was so afraid of her father, that she rarely disobeyed him. Many times over the years, Marta watched as her mother planned her escapes. She tried to leave many times but was always captured and beaten. Forced to give birth so that Ivan could have his wish, Natalia became pregnant 5 more times. Natalia watched as one by one all of her other children were murdered for being the wrong sex. The 5th child was the last straw. She was going to escape, even if it was the last thing she did. On Marta's 18th birthday, Natalia made a plan on how to get out and managed to pick Ivan's door with a hairpin and nail file. Then she went to Marta's room and told her that she would come back with the police. She wanted so desperately for them to escape from him as well, but she knew that if they came, it would be worse for all of them. Natalia sneaked downstairs and was about to open the front door. When Ivan spotted her and yelled her name, Natalia quickly opened up the door and closed it, holding it in place. When Ivan stopped trying to open it, she started to run away up the drive. Ivan went into the kitchen, grabbed his shotgun, and ran after her. Ivan had had enough. Natalia got to the road and was still in full sprint when she heard a car coming up fast behind her. Ivan hit her with his car and watched as her body flew up and landed down on the road behind him. He got out of the car and readied his shotgun. Natalia was lying on the road in agony, her leg and arm broken and twisted. "Well, I think it's about time I put you out of your misery. Any last words?" Natalia had just enough strength to look up at him and say "fuck you," and with that, he shot her dead.